Some secrets arrive uninvited, slipping through our mailboxes like unwelcome guests who refuse to leave until they've turned our entire world upside down. I'm Eleanor, and I spend my days tracing the paths of handwritten truths that shatter lives and rebuild them in ways their writers never imagined possible. Last week, I received a call from Jessica Miller in Portland, Oregon, a 46-year-old high school English teacher whose ordinary Tuesday morning had been destroyed by a piece of paper no bigger than a greeting card. This hastily written note, tucked inside an unmarked envelope, contained 3 sentences that would unravel 46 years of assumed identity and reveal a medical error so devastating that a retired nurse had carried the secret for nearly half a century. The note was simple, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had practiced these words countless times before finding the courage to send them. You are not the biological daughter of Robert and Linda Miller. There was a switch at the hospital in 1978. The other family never knew. Look for Emma Thompson if you want to know your true identity. Jessica had spent her entire life feeling like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit into her family's picture. Now she understood why she had been trying to fit into the wrong puzzle altogether. But this discovery would force her to confront an impossible question. Is it kinder to live with a comfortable lie or to pursue a truth that might destroy everyone involved? Jessica shared this story with me because her journey to uncover her real identity had taught her something profound about what family actually means, and because she hoped that others facing similar revelations might find guidance in her experience of choosing truth over comfort. Have you ever felt like you didn't quite belong in your own family, like some essential part of your identity was missing? Share your experience in the comments, because Jessica's story will show you that sometimes the answers we seek most desperately are the ones that change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. Jessica Miller had always been the anomaly in her family's genetic lineup. While her parents Robert and Linda were both fair-skinned with blue eyes and conservative temperaments, Jessica had olive skin, dark hair, and a restless spirit that seemed to come from nowhere in their family tree. Her younger brother Mark looked exactly like their father, same broad shoulders, same easy laugh, same contentment with routine and predictability. Growing up in the Miller household in Portland's quiet Laurelhurst neighborhood, Jessica had learned to accept these differences as quirks of genetic lottery. Families were full of unexplained variations, she told herself. Maybe she had inherited recessive traits from distant relatives, or maybe her artistic inclinations and love of adventure were simply her unique contribution to the family's gene pool. But the differences went beyond physical appearance. While the Millers were practical people who valued stability and tradition, Jessica had always been drawn to creative pursuits and unconventional experiences. She loved teaching literature because it allowed her to explore the complexity of human nature, while her family preferred concrete facts and straightforward solutions. She dreamed of traveling to remote places and learning about different cultures, while her parents had never seen the appeal of leaving Oregon except for occasional visits to Robert's sister in California. The morning of November 12, 2024, began like any other Tuesday in Jessica's well-ordered life. She made coffee in the kitchen of the 1920s bungalow she shared with her husband David and their 2 teenage children, reviewed lesson plans for her advanced placement English classes, and walked to the mailbox while David loaded the dishwasher and their kids gathered backpacks for school. The unmarked envelope stood out immediately among the usual collection of bills and advertising circulars. It was addressed in careful handwriting to Jessica Miller, the daughter who was switched, with no return address and a local postmark from the previous day. Jessica's first thought was that someone had made a mistake, perhaps the note was intended for a different Jessica Miller, or maybe it was some kind of cruel prank. But as she opened the envelope and read the 3 devastating sentences inside, Jessica felt something click into place in her mind, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. The note explained so many things that had never made sense about her life: why she had always felt like an observer in her own family, why her interests and instincts seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, why she had spent 46 years feeling like she was living someone else's life. Jessica read the note 5 times before the full implications began to register. If what this anonymous writer claimed was true, then Robert and Linda Miller weren't her biological parents. Mark wasn't her biological brother. The family history she had inherited, the genetic traits she thought she carried, the sense of belonging she had struggled to feel, all of it was based on a mistake made in a hospital nearly half a century ago. The note mentioned another name, Emma Thompson. According to the mysterious correspondent, Emma was the woman who had been raised by Jessica's biological family while Jessica had been raised by Emma's. If the claim was accurate, then somewhere in Oregon lived a stranger who shared Jessica's DNA and might hold the key to understanding why Jessica had always felt like she was living in the wrong life. Jessica's hand shook as she folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope. Her rational mind wanted to dismiss it as an elaborate hoax or a case of mistaken identity, but something deeper, some instinct she had learned to trust after years of feeling disconnected from her assumed heritage, told her that the anonymous writer was telling the truth. David found Jessica sitting at their kitchen table 20 minutes later, still holding the envelope and staring out the window at the maple tree they had planted when they first bought the house 15 years earlier. Their children had already left for school, and the house felt unnaturally quiet. "What's wrong?" David asked, recognizing the expression on his wife's face, the same look she got when she was working through a particularly complex problem with no obvious solution. Jessica showed him the note without explanation, watching his face change as he read the impossible claim about her identity. David was a software engineer, someone who approached problems methodically and believed in evidence-based solutions, but even he could see that this wasn't the kind of issue that could be debugged like faulty code. "This has to be a mistake," David said finally. "Or someone's idea of a sick joke. People don't just get switched at birth in real hospitals." But Jessica was already reaching for her laptop, searching online for information about hospital errors and switched babies. What she found was more disturbing than she had expected: dozens of documented cases over the past 50 years, medical mistakes that had separated biological families and created artificial ones, stories of people who had lived entire lives without knowing their true identities. The more Jessica researched, the more plausible the note's claims became. She learned that St. Mary's Hospital, where she had been born in 1978, had been investigated multiple times during the 1970s and 1980s for administrative problems and understaffing issues. She discovered that switched baby cases often went undetected for decades because families rarely questioned the children they brought home from the hospital, especially when those children were healthy and developed normally. Most unsettling of all, Jessica found herself thinking about the blood type discrepancy that had puzzled doctors during her pregnancies. Both Robert and Linda Miller had type O blood, which should have made it impossible for them to have a daughter with type A blood. When Jessica's obstetrician had mentioned this during her first pregnancy, the Millers had assumed it was a laboratory error and never pursued the question further. But if Jessica wasn't actually Robert and Linda's biological daughter, the blood type mystery made perfect sense. She wasn't a genetic anomaly, she was simply carrying someone else's DNA. By evening, Jessica had found Emma Thompson on social media. The woman lived in Salem, Oregon, just an hour south of Portland, and worked as a veterinarian at a large animal practice that served rural farming communities. From the limited information available in Emma's professional profiles, Jessica learned that she was 46 years old, exactly Jessica's age, and had never married or had children. The few photographs Jessica could find showed a woman with fair skin, light brown hair, and the same blue eyes that characterized the Miller family. Emma looked like she could be Mark's sister, while Jessica had always looked like she belonged to a different gene pool entirely. Jessica spent hours staring at these images, trying to process the possibility that this stranger might be the sister she had never known she was supposed to have, while Jessica herself might belong to a family she had never met. The implications were staggering, not just for Jessica and Emma, but for both sets of parents who had raised and loved daughters who weren't biologically their own. Jessica's first instinct was to drive immediately to Salem and confront Emma Thompson with the anonymous note, but David convinced her to approach the situation more carefully. If the claims were true, then Emma was as much a victim of the hospital error as Jessica, and she deserved to learn about the possibility gradually rather than having her world shattered by a stranger appearing at her doorstep with impossible accusations. Instead, Jessica hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, someone David's company had used for background checks and who had experience with sensitive family matters. Marcus agreed to verify the basic facts about Emma Thompson and look into the hospital records from 1978 before Jessica made any direct contact. What Marcus discovered over the next 2 weeks painted a picture that made the anonymous note's claims increasingly believable. Emma Thompson had indeed been born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1978, the same day as Jessica, just 3 hours earlier. Both babies had been delivered during a particularly busy night when the hospital was understaffed due to a flu outbreak among the nursing staff. More significantly, Marcus found documentation of several administrative errors at St. Mary's during that time period, including 2 previous cases of babies being temporarily mixed up before the mistakes were caught and corrected. The hospital had implemented new identification procedures in 1979 specifically to prevent such errors, suggesting that the March 1978 incident might not have been isolated. Marcus also discovered that Emma's adoptive father had died in a car accident when she was 12 years old, and that her mother had passed away from cancer 5 years ago. Emma had no siblings and limited extended family, which meant she had been navigating adult life largely alone while Jessica had been surrounded by the large, supportive Miller clan. Perhaps most intriguingly, Marcus learned that Emma had always felt disconnected from her adoptive family in ways that paralleled Jessica's own experience. According to public records and social media posts, Emma had struggled academically in ways that puzzled her highly educated adoptive parents, while showing exceptional aptitude for working with animals, a talent that had no obvious source in the Thompson family history. Jessica found herself obsessively researching Emma's life, looking for clues about the person who might be her biological sister. Emma's veterinary practice specialized in large animals, horses, cattle, sheep, and she had a reputation for being able to handle difficult cases that other veterinarians couldn't manage. She lived alone on a small ranch outside Salem, kept several rescue horses, and seemed to prefer the company of animals to people. The more Jessica learned about Emma, the more convinced she became that they had been living each other's intended lives. Emma's solitary, practical nature would have fit perfectly with the Thompson family's academic and reserved temperament, while Jessica's social instincts and creative spirit might have flourished in whatever family had originally produced Emma. But Jessica also realized that approaching Emma would require destroying whatever sense of identity and family history Emma had managed to construct after losing both adoptive parents. Was it fair to append another person's life based on an anonymous note that might still be wrong? The decision became more urgent when Jessica's parents announced they were planning to sell their longtime family home and move to a retirement community in Arizona. Robert, now 78, had been experiencing early signs of dementia, and Linda felt they needed to be closer to specialized medical care and age-appropriate social activities. Jessica found herself looking at her aging parents and wondering whether she had the right to burden them with questions about her identity when they were already dealing with the challenges of Robert's declining health. But she also knew that if she didn't pursue the truth now, she might lose the opportunity forever as Robert's memory continued to deteriorate. The crisis came when Jessica received a second note, postmarked a month after the first. This one was longer and more detailed. "I know you must think I'm crazy, but I was the night nurse on duty when you and Emma Thompson were born. I've carried this secret for 46 years, and I can't take it to my grave." The identification bands were switched because of a laundry mix-up. "Your bands went to the wrong babies. I tried to tell the families later, but you both seemed happy and healthy, and I was afraid of losing my job. I'm dying now, and I need you to know the truth. Please find Emma and tell her too. She deserves to understand why she never felt like she belonged with the Thompsons. Margaret Wilson, RN, retired." Margaret Wilson had included her phone number and address, along with a plea for Jessica to contact her before it was too late to get the full story. Jessica realized that her window for learning the truth was closing rapidly, not just because of Robert's dementia, but because the one person who could explain exactly what had happened was dying. "Now I need to ask you something that kept Jessica awake for weeks. If you discovered that your entire identity might be based on a medical error, would you pursue the truth even if it meant potentially destroying the peace of mind of everyone you loved? Would you contact the stranger who might be your real sister, knowing that doing so would force both of you to question everything you'd ever believed about your own families?" Because Jessica's next decision would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone connected to this 46-year-old mistake. Jessica drove to Margaret Wilson's address on a gray December morning, her heart pounding with the kind of nervous energy she hadn't felt since her first day of teaching 20 years earlier. The house was a modest ranch-style home in Beaverton, with a wheelchair ramp that had been recently added to the front porch and medical equipment visible through the living room windows. Margaret answered the door herself, though it clearly required considerable effort. She was in her 70s, thin from illness but still possessing the alert, compassionate eyes that Jessica imagined had made her an excellent nurse. Margaret's face lit up with relief when Jessica introduced herself. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Margaret said, gesturing for Jessica to sit in the living room where oxygen equipment hummed quietly in the background. "I've been wanting to tell this story for so long, but I never had the courage until the doctors told me I had 6 months left." Margaret's account of that March night in 1978 was detailed and devastating. She had been working a double shift because of staff shortages, and the maternity ward had been overwhelmed with an unusual number of births during a severe winter storm that had made travel difficult for both families and medical personnel. "You were both born within 3 hours of each other," Margaret explained, "and you were both healthy, beautiful babies. But we were so busy, and the identification system was different then. We used paper bands that had to be handwritten, and they weren't attached as securely as the plastic bracelets they use now. The error had occurred during a routine diaper change in the nursery. Margaret had removed both babies' identification bands to give them baths, and when she went to reattach them, she had been called away to assist with another emergency delivery. A different nurse had finished the task, attaching the bands based on which baby was in which bassinet, but the babies had been moved during the bathing process, and no one had noticed the switch. I realized what had happened 2 weeks later when I was reviewing the nursery logs," Margaret said, her voice heavy with decades of guilt. Both families had already taken their babies home, and everyone was so happy. I kept telling myself I would find a way to tell them, but days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Margaret had tried multiple times over the years to contact both families, but each attempt had been abandoned when she saw how well both children seemed to be thriving in their adoptive homes. Jessica had excelled in school and shown clear signs of being loved and supported by the Millers. Emma had struggled more academically but had found her passion for animals and seemed to have a close relationship with her adoptive mother. I told myself that the truth would only hurt everyone involved, Margaret continued. You both had good families who loved you, and I couldn't see how knowing about the switch would improve anyone's life. But as I got older, and especially after my own children grew up and had families, I began to understand that identity isn't just about who raises you, it's about understanding where your talents and instincts come from. Margaret showed Jessica copies of both birth certificates and hospital records that documented the timeline of that chaotic night. She also had photographs she had taken of both babies, pictures that clearly showed the physical differences that should have alerted someone to the error much sooner. You look exactly like your biological mother looked when she was young, Margaret said, showing Jessica a photo she had somehow obtained of the Thompson family. And Emma looks remarkably like your biological parents. I don't know how no one noticed, but people see what they expect to see, especially when it comes to their own children. Jessica studied the photographs with fascination and horror. The woman Margaret identified as her biological mother had the same dark hair, olive skin, and expressive eyes that had made Jessica stand out in the fair-skinned Miller family. Meanwhile, Emma's adoptive parents looked nothing like her. She clearly belonged with the Millers, who shared her coloring and even some of her facial features. Margaret also revealed information about Jessica's biological family that made the error even more poignant. Your birth parents were both teachers, she said. Your mother taught elementary school, and your father was a high school English teacher who also coached debate. They loved books and travel and had already planned to take you on educational trips as soon as you were old enough. The parallels were stunning. Jessica had become an English teacher without any family history of education, had always been drawn to literature and debate, and had spent her career trying to instill in her students the same love of learning that apparently came from her biological parents' DNA. Emma's biological family were farmers, Margaret continued. They raised horses and cattle, and both her biological parents had that quiet, practical nature that works so well with animals. Emma's talents make perfect sense when you understand where she actually came from. Margaret had one final revelation that made Jessica realize the full scope of what had been lost. Your biological parents tried to have more children for years after you were born, but your mother had complications that made pregnancy impossible. Emma's biological parents also stopped having children after Emma's birth due to medical issues. You were both only children, but you were supposed to be only children in each other's families. Jessica left Margaret's house with copies of all the documentation and a profound sense of responsibility. She wasn't just carrying her own story anymore, she was carrying Emma's story too, and the stories of 4 parents who had loved and raised daughters they had never been meant to have. The drive home gave Jessica time to process the magnitude of what she had learned. The anonymous notes hadn't been cruel pranks or mistaken identity, they had been the confession of a dying woman who could no longer live with a secret that had shaped 5 lives for nearly half a century. But knowing the truth was only the beginning. Jessica now had to decide whether to contact Emma Thompson and risk destroying another person's sense of identity, or whether to keep Margaret's secret and live with the knowledge that somewhere in Oregon was a woman who deserved to understand why she had always felt like a stranger in her own life. I want to take a moment here to thank all of you who follow these stories and share your own experiences with family secrets and identity questions. Jessica's journey shows us how complex the relationship between biology and belonging can be, and how sometimes the truth requires more courage to handle than the lies we've been living with. Your comments and support help others navigate these difficult discoveries and remind us that we're not alone in questioning who we really are. Jessica spent 3 weeks researching Emma Thompson before finally working up the courage to make contact. She learned that Emma ran her veterinary practice from a clinic attached to her ranch, that she specialized in equine medicine, and that she had a reputation throughout the Willamette Valley for being able to work with horses that other veterinarians had given up on as untreatable. Emma's social media presence was minimal but revealing. Her few posts showed a woman who was most comfortable outdoors, working with animals, living a life that was solitary but seemed genuinely fulfilling. There were photos of Emma treating injured horses, volunteering at animal rescue organizations, and participating in rural community events that centered around livestock and farming. Jessica also discovered that Emma had been adopted by the Thompsons when she was 3 days old, the same age Jessica had been when she went home with the Miller family. This meant both babies had been switched before any bonding period with their biological parents, which perhaps explained why the error had gone undetected for so long. The decision to contact Emma came when Jessica learned that Emma's veterinary practice was struggling financially due to a lawsuit from a client whose horse had been injured during treatment. Emma was facing the possibility of losing her ranch and having to relocate her practice, which would mean leaving the only community where she had ever felt a sense of belonging. Jessica realized that Emma deserved to know the truth about her identity, not just for emotional reasons but for practical ones. If Emma was actually a biological member of the Miller family, she might have access to family resources and support that could help her save her veterinary practice and her home. Jessica's first approach was carefully planned and indirect. She arranged to visit Emma's clinic under the pretense of seeking treatment for a horse, even though Jessica had never owned a horse in her life. She borrowed a friend's aging mare who was suffering from mild arthritis and made an appointment for a consultation. The meeting between Jessica and Emma was electric in ways that neither woman fully understood at the time. Emma had the same practical, no-nonsense approach to problem-solving that characterized the Miller family, while Jessica found herself responding to Emma's calm competence with a sense of recognition she couldn't explain. "Your horse is in good shape for her age," Emma said after examining the borrowed mare. "The arthritis is manageable with proper medication and exercise. But I have to ask, have we met before? You seem familiar somehow." Jessica felt her carefully prepared cover story dissolving under Emma's direct gaze. There was something about Emma's manner, straightforward, honest, slightly impatient with social niceties, that reminded Jessica powerfully of her father Robert and her brother Mark. "I don't think we've met," Jessica said, "but I've been thinking the same thing about you. You remind me of my family in ways I can't quite put into words." They spent 2 hours talking that afternoon, ostensibly about horse care but actually discovering an inexplicable connection that seemed to go deeper than their brief acquaintance could justify. Emma mentioned feeling like she had never quite fit in with her adoptive family's academic interests, while Jessica found herself sharing her own sense of being a genetic anomaly among the practical, traditional Millers. "It's strange," Emma said as they walked through the pastures where she kept her rescue horses, "but talking to you feels like talking to family. I've never had that experience with someone I just met." Jessica realized that she couldn't continue the deception any longer. Emma deserved to know why their conversation felt so natural, and why Jessica had really come to the clinic. That evening, Jessica called Emma and asked if they could meet again to discuss something important. Their second meeting took place at a coffee shop in Salem, neutral territory where they could talk without the distraction of horses or veterinary concerns. Jessica brought copies of all the documentation Margaret Wilson had provided, along with the anonymous notes that had started her investigation. Emma's reaction to the revelation was remarkably calm, considering the magnitude of what Jessica was telling her. She listened to the entire story without interruption, studied the hospital records and photographs, and asked practical questions about verification and next steps. "This explains so many things," Emma said finally. "I always wondered why I was so different from my adoptive parents, why I struggled in school when they were both professors, why I felt most comfortable working with my hands instead of my mind." Emma revealed that she had often fantasized about her biological family, imagining them as practical, rural people who would understand her love of animals and outdoor work. Learning that her biological father had been a farmer and her biological mother had grown up on a ranch felt like validation of instincts she had carried her entire life. "What about you?" Emma asked. "How do you feel about learning that your biological parents were teachers?" Jessica described the shock of recognition she had felt when Margaret told her about her biological parents' careers and interests. "I became an English teacher without any family history of education," she said. "I've always loved literature and debate and travel, but those interests seemed to come from nowhere in the Miller family tree." They agreed to pursue DNA testing to confirm Margaret's account, though both women already felt certain that the retired nurse had been telling the truth. More importantly, they had to decide whether to involve their respective families in the revelation, or whether to keep the discovery private. Emma's situation was simpler because both her adoptive parents had died. She had no siblings to consider and limited extended family who might be affected by learning about the hospital error. But Jessica faced the complex challenge of deciding whether to tell the aging Miller parents that the daughter they had raised and loved for 46 years wasn't biologically their child. "What do you think your parents would want to know?" Emma asked. Jessica had been struggling with this question for weeks. Robert's dementia was progressing, and she wasn't sure he would be able to process such complex information. Linda was still sharp but dealing with the stress of caring for a husband whose personality was slowly disappearing. Was it kind or cruel to burden them with a truth that might make them question a lifetime of love and family bonds? Emma offered a perspective that surprised Jessica. Maybe the question isn't whether to tell them, but when to tell them. And maybe it matters more how we tell them than whether we tell them. They decided to spend time getting to know each other as sisters before involving the broader family. If they were going to reshape everyone's understanding of family relationships, they wanted to do it from a position of strength and mutual support rather than as strangers trying to navigate an impossible situation together. Over the next 6 months, Jessica and Emma built the sibling relationship they should have had their entire lives. They met weekly for coffee, visited each other's homes, and discovered dozens of shared traits that had been mysterious in their original families but made perfect sense in the context of their switched identities. Jessica learned that Emma had always dreamed of having a sister, someone who could understand her practical nature and share her love of quiet outdoor activities. Emma discovered that Jessica possessed the artistic sensitivity and social skills that would have balanced Emma's more reserved temperament if they had grown up together. More significantly, they began to see how their switched identities had actually created positive outcomes despite the initial error. Jessica's creative instincts had been nurtured and developed in the Miller family's supportive environment, while her biological family's practical focus might have discouraged her artistic pursuits. Emma's love of animals and outdoor work had flourished in the Thompson family's rural setting, while growing up in the Miller family's suburban environment might have limited her access to the agricultural experiences that shaped her career. "Maybe we ended up where we needed to be," Emma said during one of their long conversations. "Not where we were supposed to be genetically, but where we could become the people we were meant to become." The DNA test results, when they arrived in March 2025, confirmed what both women already knew: they were biological sisters, and the hospital error that Margaret Wilson had described was absolutely accurate. But more importantly, the test results gave them the confidence to approach their respective families with the truth about their identities. Jessica chose to tell her parents gradually, starting with the basic fact that she had discovered she was adopted. Robert's response was limited by his cognitive decline, but Linda's reaction was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "We always knew you were different," Linda said, holding Jessica's hands as they sat in the living room where Jessica had grown up. "Your father and I used to joke that you must have inherited traits from some adventurous ancestor we didn't know about. But Jessica, you have to understand, you were never less our daughter because you didn't share our DNA. You were exactly the daughter we needed." Linda's acceptance of the truth made it easier for Jessica to introduce the concept of Emma as her biological sister. When the two women finally met, Linda immediately recognized Emma as having the Miller family's practical temperament and straightforward manner. "Emma looks like Robert did when he was young," Linda observed, studying old family photographs. "She has his hands and his way of approaching problems. It's remarkable how genetics work, isn't it?" The most emotional moment came when Jessica brought Emma to meet Robert during one of his clearer periods. Despite his dementia, Robert seemed to recognize something familiar in Emma's manner and appearance. "You remind me of my father," Robert told Emma, reaching out to touch her hand. "He had that same gentle way with animals and that same practical wisdom about how things work." Emma was equally moved by the encounter. "I've never had a father figure since mine died when I was 12, she told Jessica afterward. "Even with his illness, Robert makes me understand something about myself that I've never understood before." The integration of both families was surprisingly smooth. Jessica's children, now teenagers, were fascinated by the idea of having an aunt they had never known about, especially one who owned horses and ran her own business. David appreciated Emma's straightforward nature and was impressed by her professional competence in managing both her veterinary practice and her ranch. Emma, meanwhile, found herself welcomed into a large, supportive extended family that included not just Jessica's immediate household but also Mark and his children, Linda's siblings, and their families, and the network of friends and colleagues who had been part of the Miller Circle for decades. The practical benefits of the discovery were significant as well. When Emma's veterinary practice faced financial difficulties due to the lawsuit, the Miller family was able to provide both financial support and business advice that helped her restructure her debts and expand her client base. Jessica's teaching background proved valuable in helping Emma develop educational programs for horse owners, while Emma's practical skills helped Jessica and David with home improvement projects they had been postponing for years. But perhaps the most important outcome was the sense of completeness that both women experienced after learning their true identities. Jessica no longer felt like a genetic anomaly in her family. She understood that her artistic instincts and love of literature came from her biological parents, while her capacity for love and her strong moral foundation came from being raised by the Millers. Emma finally understood why she had always felt most comfortable working with her hands and spending time outdoors, while also recognizing that her adoptive family had given her the financial resources and educational opportunities that had made her veterinary career possible. Margaret Wilson died peacefully in her sleep 2 months after Jessica and Emma had their first meeting as acknowledged sisters. Before her death, she was able to meet both women and see that her decision to finally reveal the truth had created healing rather than harm for everyone involved. "I spent 46 years worrying that the truth would destroy 2 families," Margaret told them during their final visit. "Instead, it created one larger family that's stronger because it's based on choice as well as biology." Today, Jessica and Emma live less than an hour apart and see each other weekly. Jessica has become involved in Emma's veterinary practice, using her teaching skills to develop client education programs, while Emma has helped Jessica and David create a small horse boarding operation on their expanded property. They celebrate holidays together now, with Emma joining the Miller family traditions she should have grown up with, while Jessica has learned to appreciate the quieter, more practical celebrations that Emma prefers. Their children consider each other cousins, and Linda has gained the practical, animal-loving daughter she never knew she was missing. Most remarkably, both women feel that they now understand themselves more completely than ever before. They carry the genetics of their biological families and the love and values of their adoptive families, making them fuller, more complex people than they would have been if the hospital error had never occurred. As Jessica told me when she shared this story, learning that I was switched at birth didn't make me question who I really am. It helped me understand that I'm the product of both families, biological and adoptive. The Millers gave me the foundation to become the person I was meant to be, and finding Emma helped me understand where my instincts and talents originally came from. Emma added her own perspective. Jessica and I didn't lose 46 years of sisterhood, we gained 46 years of different experiences that made us more interesting to each other when we finally met. The hospital error was a mistake, but it wasn't a tragedy. Sometimes the wrong choice leads you to exactly where you need to be. What strikes me most about this story is how it challenges our assumptions about identity and belonging. Jessica and Emma discovered that family is both more and less than biology, that love and shared experiences can create bonds as strong as genetics, while understanding our biological heritage can help us make sense of traits and instincts that otherwise seem mysterious. What would you have done in Jessica's situation? Would you have pursued the truth about your identity, or would you have chosen to preserve the peace of mind of your adoptive family? And how do you think learning about a switched identity later in life might be different from discovering it as a young person? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story reminds us that identity is more complex than we often acknowledge, and that sometimes the most important discoveries about ourselves come from understanding not just who raised us, but where our deepest instincts and talents originally came from. If this story made you think about the complexity of family relationships and identity, please subscribe for more discoveries that explore what it means to belong and how we become who we're meant to be. Your support helps me continue preserving these profound human stories that remind us how complicated and beautiful family bonds can be. I'm Eleanor, and I spend my days tracing the paths of handwritten truths that shatter lives and rebuild them in ways their writers never imagined possible. Margaret's note to Jessica reminds us that sometimes the most devastating revelations are also the most healing, and that the truth has a way of creating the connections we need most, even when it arrives 46 years late. Until next time, remember that identity is both more fragile and more resilient than we think, and that discovering who we really are often requires the courage to question everything we thought we knew about where we came from.